and welcome to
Okay.
our
Morning, Larry.
128th episode of the Veritas Fact Finding Series. And this morning, I'm joined by Professor Fred Lazar. Fred, good morning.
Good morning, Anthony. Pleasure to be here.
We're back again live to go on the ground and speak to industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. If you're watching and you like what you hear, give us a like and follow us at www.veritascorp.com. Quick disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of the Veritas Group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and of course Fred in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we might not agree with. Although I've known Fred now a long time, and I'm not sure that's possible. I could go on for quite some time with Professor Lazar's bio. I'm going to keep this tight because if I don't say these things, he never will, as he's incredibly humble. He's an associate professor at the Schulich School of Business in the Department of Economics at York University, where he's been teaching, and this year is his 53rd year of teaching. He told me last night over dinner that he started when he was 5 years old. So in case anybody's wondering, his PhD is from Harvard, and Fred has worked at the highest levels of government and industry, advising the Prime Minister's office, serving as an expert witness in major land settlement cases, and consulting for organizations like Air Canada, Ontario Energy Board, and even Porter Airlines before we knew it as Porter Airlines. He's written not one or two books, but 12 books. He's authored dozens of research papers and has been in the forefront of economic policy, business strategy now for decades. Today, we're going to tap into his wealth of knowledge and discuss the current leadership race that's going on in the Liberal Party, the looming tariffs in the U.S., and ultimately what this all means for not just everyday Canadians, but of course all of us on the screen that are investors. How are we going to get through this? Fred, welcome to the show.
Again, it's a pleasure to be here, Anthony.
All right, let's start out with setting the stage, and I think we'll set the stage by looking at the leadership, the Liberal leadership race. How do you see this playing out? And what do you think that it means for the future leadership of Canada? And of course, our timing is interesting because we're just coming off the debate from yesterday.
Well, I think Mark Carney has the upper hand. He's got the support of, a majority of the cabinet ministers. And even before the Prime Minister stepped down, a lot of people were sort of pushing Mark Carney forward. So I think he'll win the leadership. Now, what will happen in the election? That again will depend upon how quickly an election is called. The sooner it's called, I think, the more favorable it'll be for Carney and the Liberals. If he waits till late summer, early fall, a lot can happen during that time. And I don't think it'll necessarily be positive for Carney and the Liberals. The other sort of big unknown is what happens with Trump, his tariffs, and the economy. And that can go any way. With Trump, it's unpredictable. He says one thing one day, another thing the next day. And what is his true intent? What is his true strategy? Flip a coin and pick one or the other. That's the best I can make of it. So if he calls an early election, Carney, I doubt he'll get a majority. He may get a plurality, but the balance of power is going to lie with the bloc. The NDP, I think, will be decimated. So it's going to be the bloc that will pick the next prime minister. And they may not necessarily go with Carney.
Very interesting. So, in the backdrop of all of this, there's another election actually happening today,
Yes,
as we speak. And I think that, especially in this prorogue, whatever, I had to Google that when it came up. We were proroguing Parliament. Like, this can only happen in Canada, where we can have lack of leadership. So what we've seen really over the last couple of months, largely, is the provinces or the premiers stepping up to pretend to be the leader. And how do you see that playing out, and how does that affect sort of the balance of power?
Well, I think, like everyone else, that Ford will win, and most likely with a majority. Once more, the NDP just is cratering. The Greens are not going to sort of replace them, and Bonnie Crombie just, I guess, hasn't had enough time to make herself known. And if you were to ask just an average person on the street, what's what do the Liberals stand for? What's the Liberal platform? They, like I, will probably respond, I don't know. Here's some guesses. I'm not sure what exactly they stand for. So I think, Ford will win. Will Crombie remain as leader? It depends on how well or how badly she does. Hopefully she does remain. And then she has some time to really develop a presence and tell the people in the province, this is what the party stands for. Ford will sort of claim he's now the spokesperson for Canada, but I don't think he has any idea what to do. So,
So
that's
let, let,
that's my gut instinct.
let's unpack a little bit now and transition to Trump. And before I do that, I want to remind everybody the last couple of sessions that we've done here, we had Melanie Politis, and she talked about how that the election could be called quickly if there's a non-confidence vote. It could be called in the fall, but it doesn't have to be. It could be. This could wait until the fall of 2026, which I'm telling you, for those that watched live, my face went white. I can't believe it. But that is something that could happen because we live in Canada. Canada here, the maximum is 5 years, not 4. We just get stuck thinking like Americans all the time. We got to change that. So with that, let's talk about tariffs. And I mean, your book, it was written actually before a lot of the people on the call here were probably alive. We're talking 1981, and the timing. I'm going to take everybody back there. That's before we had free trade. In those days, we still had a tariff regime, and there was discussion of going to a free trade environment here in North America. And what would that look like? And so that book called The New Protectionism and it was really groundbreaking at the time. And so maybe you can take us over past the last 4 decades of time and reflect back and to what we have today.
Okay, that book was written on the Tokyo round, and the Tokyo round was sort of the second consecutive round that started addressing non-tariff measures. The first 5 rounds were negotiated quite quickly. They all resulted in significant cuts in tariffs. And unfortunately, what happened is as global tariffs declined and more countries joined the GATT and then the World Trade Organization, more and more countries resorted to non-tariff measures. Subsidies, for example, the imposition of quotas, harassment under the existing trade laws. So the overall level of protection didn't seem to be declining. And so my book addressed that, saying, well, everybody talks about free trade, more liberal trade, but the reality is domestic political pressures make it difficult for countries to actually commit themselves. So as they reduce tariffs to open up the markets, they introduce other policies that restrict access or try to, give their companies an unfair advantage. And then after that, we had the Uruguay round, which again tackled non-tariff measures. And what was interesting is sort of the rounds after the first 5 that focused strictly on tariffs, the later rounds dealt with much more complex issues, and they took longer and longer to reach any conclusion. And then we're now with the Doha round, which started in 2001. It's the last multilateral trade negotiation round. It has yet to be completed, and I'm betting that it will never be completed. And the reasons for that is they're tackling serious issues. When you talk about subsidies, you're not talking about, well, what government programs are acceptable. And let's take the case of Canada. What stands out? Our healthcare system. Could it be viewed as an unfair subsidy to Canadian-based companies? Absolutely. If a trade dispute were launched challenging that, I think there's a better than 50-50 chance Canada would lose. And then you look at other countries with their various social programs, income support programs, etc., and they're promoting various companies, various industries. They could all be challenged, and countries are reluctant to make those concessions. And then when you throw in that somehow the North or the developed countries have to support the South or the poor countries,
The pigs.
which is a good objective. But the question, how do you do this without creating problems for companies and employees in the developed countries? And how do you ensure that whatever sort of benefits you give to the poor countries aren't simply stolen by the kleptocrats that rule many of these countries? So this should become much more complex. And what we've seen is a move to regionalism. So a lot more regional free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements, and the world is breaking up into trading blocks rather than one global trading bloc.
It's very interesting because you touch on some things that you and I have kind of unpacked in recent discussions, because we see as, this is like, why is he picking on us? This doesn't make any sense. He's coming at us. We're his friends. We're his allies. And you touched on some things that I'd like you to explain to people, because, these unfair subsidies. So yes, we have free trade, Canada, US, let's say, and Mexico. But part of the things that are irking the Americans, let's say, what are those exactly? You touched on the healthcare, you touched on the income support, the safety nets that we have here. There's also, dairy issues. Maybe you can unpack that and explain why that makes the tariffs not so crazy.
Okay, I think there are sort of two separate sets of objectives. The first, national security and defense. And you look at a globe, the shortest distance between Russia and or China to the US is over the North Pole. Well, what is up there? Nunavut, it's part of Canada. NORAD has stations up there, but the US really wants to build up their military presence in the far north. Is that an unreasonable demand? No, I think it's quite reasonable, and it actually would help start developing Nunavut, the Northwest Territories. Related to that is making the Northwest Passage a year-round possibility.
Mm-hmm.
That's important economically. It's important from a military point of view. Again, anything wrong with that? No, we can now have ports in the most northern parts of Canada along the Arctic Ocean. That too will benefit us. And then obviously drugs. I'm not sure, what the amount of drugs are that come from Canada, but there might be a related issue that Big Pharma in the US doesn't like the possibility of Americans being able to buy drugs from Canadian companies because the prices here in Canada are much lower than the US. So that's one set of issues. Access to resources, that's just been blown up. I mean, the resources to get developed require massive investments in infrastructure. There are no roads, there are no rail lines, poor airports up in the north where the resources are found. So, could the US work with us, in particular with indigenous communities up there, to somehow access the resources much more rapidly? That would benefit Canada immensely. And the reality is, who would be the customers for these resources? China or the US? From whom are we going to get better prices? Flip a coin. I don't think we're going to get world prices from either one. And I don't think the US is going to offer more advantageous prices than China. Then the second set, okay, on the trade side, what might be some of the issues? Access to dairy farm is right up there on the list. Wisconsin farmers are really upset. The US didn't get much in the USMCA, and I think they'd like to open up the market. That's going to be the most difficult political issue for Canada, because now you're alienating Quebec. From my point of view, and I think Canadians would be much better off if we open up the market and we would see price of dairy products drop dramatically. And let's just write out checks to the dairy farmers, tell them you had a nice run. We'll just pay you to keep your mouth shut and go elsewhere. Besides that, healthcare, maybe. U.S. hasn't done anything thus far, so I'm not sure that they may proceed. Foreign ownership restrictions, we do have them in several key sectors. The U.S. would like them eliminated. The subsidies are provided to attract the electric battery manufacturers. That probably will be sort of a target. And again, the value of the dollar. When we signed the free trade agreement, a lot of people expected that Canada would be forced to maintain parity with the US dollar, so a depreciation wouldn't give Canadian-based companies an advantage. Well, after the first announcement, early February, the dollar declined, from 135 to about 150. If the tariffs go into effect, the dollar is going to decline to about 160, 165. And the US, I think, will attack that. Can Canada do anything to try to sort of appreciate the value of our dollar against the US dollar? Not much. That will be an interesting sort of a situation. So when you look at what could be done from a trade perspective, the only contentious issue will be the dairy farmers. Anything else, I think in the overall scheme of things, will be quite trivial, with a possible exception of moving our dollar closer to parity.
You touch on something, and I want to remind everybody we are live, and that's why sometimes we run into glitches. So if you have a question, please put that in the chat, and I'll make sure that I ask Fred. One of the things you touch on is currency, and it's now, I hate, because I've been concerned about the Canadian dollar. It's been for the better part of almost 2 years, really. But definitely in the last year and 6 months, especially. But now I feel like it's consent. It's like front page of the Globe that, Canadian dollar's in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. You look at the interest rate differential, widest it's ever been. All the banks here in Canada, all their economists they have the same chart that shows the Canadian dollar getting hammered, which goes like that. Only started in November. It used to be that everything was going to be nice and smooth and the Canadian dollar would be strong. Now, all of a sudden, everybody hates the Canadian dollar, which makes me actually always wonder what the hell's going on in the other direction, and remind everybody that the US dollar, the Canadian dollar is not pegged, or the US dollar is not pegged. So if the US dollar goes down, the Canadian dollar goes up. It's not like you got to get two things right. But so we can talk about that a little bit, but also the concept that, our dollar falling will make the US upset, because that messes with the trade. And so, but if our Canadian dollar falls, how do we deal with that? We increase interest rates. If we increase interest rates, well, now we got a bigger problem, because already Joe Sixpack can't make mortgage payments that are coming up over the next year at the record rate now. And we're having problems. So how do we unpack this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you look at what's happened to the dollar. If it collapses further, I can play some sort of interesting games, let's say, into the auto industry, where essentially it costs nothing to the US auto companies. And who ends up paying the tariff? The province of Ontario and the federal government, because they're going to just shift
Subsidize
profits to the US, take advantage of the lower tax rates there, and they're going to be lower corporate profits reported in Canada, and lower tax rates. Now, in terms of what we do with the dollar for a long time was a petrocurrency. It tended to sort of move in line with oil prices. So what can be done to move the dollar up? Well, if we could fast track pipelines into the US, if we could fast track new resource projects, or at least announce now we're going to make massive investments in infrastructure to access the resources, that would push up the Canadian dollar. That would result in significant appreciation. But then we may fall into the trap of the so-called Dutch disease, where our dependence on resources lead to an appreciation of our currency, which negatively impacts our manufacturing and service sectors. So economics always talks about trade-offs. You do one thing, well, what are the repercussions elsewhere? There is no pure win-win situation. I'd be quite happy again. Let's invest heavily in developing our resources. The future for Canada, in my opinion, for a number of years has been it's the North. That's where we have the resources. The Northwest Passage will become sort of viable year-round. We can become a major transportation sort of hub. If you look at shipping from Eastern Asia to Europe, shortest point is through the Northwest Passage, not through either the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. So there's a lot of potential, but there are a lot of problems. So we've had the Ring of Fire up in Northern Ontario. When was originally discovered? 15, 20 years ago?
Yep.
A shovel still hasn't been put in the ground. There's still multi-party negotiations trying to figure out how to share the wealth. Well, my view has always been 100% of nothing is a small number. X% of a large number, everybody benefits. And yet nobody sees this. So if it's taken 15, 20 years and we still haven't developed that resource, unless we come up with a better way of negotiating with Indigenous people and fast tracking these projects, we can talk about resources. 20, 30 years from now, we'll still be talking about developing those resources.
And I'm glad you brought this up. I don't know how many people were paying attention, but in your experience, you have extensive. Can I use the word extensive? But I think it's quite extensive involvement and advising of Native relations. And so, many will point to that being the main sticking point. Okay. And we've had other experts on our show here talk about how it's really government problems. And so don't go there, because I know all the red tape that we have from governments. Maybe that's going to be, worked on, because I'm reading the Globe on the front page, BC says, hey, maybe we can work with Alberta about something. Quebec saying, oh yeah, maybe we can put that pipeline, that one that you guys said we should have done like 9 years ago. Well, maybe we can make that happen now. Anyway, I'm going to lose my mind. But these things, now, at least we're talking about it, right? They say that change comes, unfortunately, when it's forced. If you tell somebody they got to get off their butt, they don't do that until it's on fire. So it's on fire right now. So how do you think that we should deal with the Natives and get these projects done?
Okay, there's sort of two issues. Anytime I've talked to a First Nation or Inuit group with a resource project, I keep telling them, don't take an equity stake. Do two things. Take a royalty off gross revenues, because then you get a significant income stream, and then make sure that a fund is built up to basically sort of reclaim the mine, put it back, the land to its original condition, and an Indigenous company or companies will have that responsibility in the other contracts. As for employment and other sort of services, well, you're the only ones up there, so you're going to get them regardless. The problems have been twofold. One, unfortunately, infighting among the Indigenous people. And that's been one of the problems with Ring of Fire. Instead of looking at this can benefit a number of different First Nations, you have three in particular that are fighting to have sort of the largest share of what revenues will flow to the First Nations. So they keep delaying, postponing, and fighting. So that's one problem. And then the second problem is, again, provincial, federal governments fighting over what will be their shares of the revenues. They see this as, this is going to be massive revenues for them. And while it's a provincial jurisdiction, the federal government wants its fair share. So you've got those two groups fighting. Private sector, I'm sure they would be quite happy to say, you want a royalty here, great, let's get this going. The sooner the better for everyone. As for the final cleanup, whether it's 10, 20, 30 years down the road, that's got to be done. And to build up a fund, again, that's not problematic.
So you actually see that there is a potential that, you could get the First Nations, you see a way that we get them to the table and get all the governments together. And your view is, instead of taking equity stakes, everybody take a royalty. That way they win regardless of cost, regardless of getting production. They sell an ounce, you get money.
Well, I mean, think of the pipeline. The pipeline is going to run through a number of First Nations traditional lands.
Yes.
So you have a choice of dealing with all of them at one time and saying, here's the deal, here's the royalty, here's sort of the contracts you're going to get, and you'll figure out how to share it. What has happened, and I used to joke around, Enbridge, when they had some pipeline out west, they were the poster child for how to negotiate as badly as possible, because they negotiated one First Nation at a time. So then when you got to the last one or two, you ended up with a classic holdout problem.
Of course.
Oh, okay. So we're the last ones to improve.
We want double.
We want.
Yeah.
Okay. You can't negotiate that way.
Things seem so simple. How come they just don't call you and you just say, hey, let me deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, this is plain.
You've done that.
This is plain common sense. Anybody who looks at it would have reached the same conclusion that I do. But again, you have political infighting at too many levels. And everyone sees this as, aha, here's sort of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I want the entire pot of gold. And in the process, there is no pot of gold and no one gets anything.
All right, let's distill this down to how we're going to make some money, because obviously it's important that we fix Canada, but all that's going to lead to how we're going to deal with our investments. And I mean, the cloud that's on our auto parts, the cloud that's sitting over our energy, and manufacturing generally, is very dark. And so, if you were advising us on the investment side, and I'll tell everybody a quick little anecdote. Back in 2000 and 2001, when I wrote about Bombardier, and I was commenting about their accounting and their governance, and they threatened me with a lawsuit, and it was that was just unbelievable, the experience we had with them. But at that same time, Professor Lazar, that's how I first found out about him. He wrote a big report commenting about strategically how they'd made disastrous decisions. And so his strategy problems with my accounting problems, stock went from 20 to, I don't know, pennies. Talk to us about where we should invest today.
That was a footnote with Bombardier. They also threatened lawsuits against me. And my conclusion at that time was they were worth more dead than alive. So I sold the pieces at that point because they had simply lost their focus.
And that's in fact what they did. They sold all the pieces. Anyway, carry on.
Anyhow, going forward, you've got this cloud of what's going to happen at the end of the day with the tariffs. Will he? Won't he? If he does, how much? How long? And for the average investor, the average person in Canada, there's nothing we can do about it. But we can put pressure on our governments, provincial and federal. And I've said this quite a while. If we had played it right, we would have set up a small team that would have gone down mid-November, talked to the Trump team and said, okay, what are the issues here? And let's try to resolve them to our mutual advantage. And that could have been done probably within a month, 2 months, with the exception of sort of dairy in Quebec. But I think even the Trump team would have recognized that that's going to be done slowly. And the tariff threat would never have materialized. But we didn't do that.
Yep.
And we're not doing that. To threaten, okay, we're going to retaliate. Well, if I were advising Trump, I would say, okay, let the clowns retaliate. Whom are they going to hurt? They're going to hurt themselves Canadian consumers will pay for it. Canadian companies will pay for it. The Canadian governments will see lower tax revenues, and the investment climate will be miserable in Canada for a long time. And I've said, in one respect, we've already lost the battle, because one of the main reasons we entered the free trade agreement to begin with was to get under the US umbrella, so we don't get sideswiped in US trade disputes. Well, softwood lumber should have, taught us that's not going to happen. This particular threat makes it clear to companies we're never going to escape the possibility of US retaliation. So if we're looking at investment decisions, where do we want to grow? Where do we want to start up? Regardless of the dollar, I'm going to go to the US because probably a more favorable tax regime, but I have confidence. I can serve not only the US market, but the complete North American market and not worry about trade disputes. So we've messed that up, and that's going to cost us over time. So the uncertainties will be there until our Canadian leaders finally realize, let's fight them, toe to toe. You're not going to win. Let's start being reasonable and start negotiating with them, find out really what irks them, see what we can do that's reasonable, and many of the things actually be favorable to us. We complain about telecommunications, the high prices. People talk about competition in the airline industry. Well, okay, get rid of the foreign ownership rules. That's sort of your best hope for increasing competition. Will it happen? Who knows? On the banking side, well, interestingly, our banks could be 100% owned by Americans, as long as no single individual owns more than 15%. So that's not an issue. So again, other than dairy farms and maybe the threat to our healthcare system, which in fact might be what's necessary to ensure that it survives, that is increasing sort of private participation, what are the problems?
Some great questions I'm going to get to. John's put in, but before I get to those questions, I want to just splice some of your comments a little bit, because so if we could get specific, would you be saying, look, I'd be buying right now the depressed auto parts guys. I'd be thinking that energy here is going to be the place to be, or resources. What sort of?
Yeah, I think resources have a good future. Well, we'll stumble our way into making the right decisions. With regards to infrastructure, I've asked, we do have a lot of really talented engineers.
Yes.
Certainly we do have the technology to build permanent roads, permanent rail lines across the north. So those sectors will benefit once we begin to accept the fact that from an economic point of view, the North is our future.
All right, let's get to some interesting questions. This one's a currency question, goes back to some of the comments we were making. There was an interesting paper from Stephen Miran. He's the chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. And we got a link. We'll send that out to everyone after. But the question related to that, tariffs will provide revenue, but will they offset but will it be offset by currency adjustments? Assuming a 25% tariff, what currency offset do you feel will be reflected in the CAD? On September 25th, the CAD went to 74. Assuming 50% of the 25% tariff is offset, the CAD would fall to 65. Currently, it's at 69, worst case scenario. Given our central bank is hell-bent on getting rates to zero, seems like the loonie has only one way to go, which could be much lower. Yeah, and you talked about this a little bit already, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if the tariffs are put into place, whether it's beginning of March, end of March at some point, I can see the value of our dollar testing sort of the historic lows, hitting easily 62 cents, probably falling even below 60 cents. So if you look at the decline in the tariffs from the the decline in the value of the dollar prior to the threat of the tariffs to their imposition, they will probably have completely offset the effects of the tariffs. Okay, so who's going to pay? Canadian consumers
Yeah.
and Canadian companies that import, capital goods, import various other inputs to produce products to ship in North America or perhaps other parts of the world. So they're going to be negatively impacted.
And if we don't deal with our tax rate issues,
Yep.
like they say that California is the most, far-leaning left state. For fun, last night over our during dinner, I looked at what the tax rate there is. Well, the highest tax rate's at $1 million, and that goes to 47%. In this great province, that's at 53, and that's at 220 or something, 230. It's crazy. Anyway, so because otherwise companies are just going to move from Canada and go to the US and set up because the tax rate's lower, personally and corporately.
Absolutely. I mean, I teach my students in international trade. I said, let's look at the European unions of the countries. Who are the wealthiest? Well, after Luxembourg is Ireland. And you say, well, Ireland, what do they do? They're a tax haven. I saw that Accenture is headquartered in Ireland.
Yeah.
And they have generated enormous wealth through low corporate taxes. We have this sort of myth here that you have to tax corporations, you have to tax corporations. Well, they don't really pay the tax, for one. And two, they can structure their operations to shift profits around. So if we had any wisdom at the political level, we would drop the corporate tax rate to about 10%. We would get a massive windfall. And all of a sudden, we would see many companies relocating their headquarters or significant parts of their operations to this country.
Listen, I think you should just put your application in. You have my vote. If you're ready, you can take over leadership.
No.
Let's talk quickly on resources. We get another question from John, and then we'll wrap it up. Can some sort of politically correct version of eminent domain ever resurface in Canada to speed up getting our resources, specifically oil and gas, off the West Coast?
No. And the reason for that is all the resources are either on the reserves of First Nations or run through the traditional lands. So unless we bring them in from the outset as full partners in the negotiations, nothing will happen. If you try to negotiate excluding them, you're in court, and it ends up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will likely side with First Nations, as the Supreme Court should. So whatever strategy one may want to pursue, whatever infrastructure one wants to develop, whatever resources one wants to develop, from day one, you've got to bring in all the First Nations involved. And again, simply say, here's the royalty. You'll be responsible to clean up. You'll get the jobs. You'll get some service contracts, and let's proceed.
You mentioned the royalties, and John followed up again here asking, and I probably should have picked this up too, so thanks, John, is First Nations, how open are they to royalties as opposed to economic interest?
I think that's an education issue. And I think it wouldn't be too difficult to explain to them the benefits. In a couple of groups I've talked to, they immediately understood this, and they said, right, why should we even take advantage of sort of this favorable lending policy the government has, where they'll lend us money at almost zero interest rate so we can buy an equity stake? Why don't we just take 3% off the top, and that becomes an annuity for the life of the project? And if they want to take an equity stake, yeah, fine. I don't see the value in it, but if for some reason they think it's important, I'll let them do so.
All right. And if all this falls apart, we'll just listen to some Rolling Stones who I could see you're a big fan of. And,
Absolutely.
yeah, me too. Maybe we do need some sympathy here for the devil, and maybe we can.
Well said, Anthony. Well said.
All right, let's wrap up. As I always like to ask my guests, um, your favorite breakfast and your favorite restaurant to have breakfast.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you because I'm actually quite boring.
I know.
The only times I ever eat breakfast uh, will be either I go to Starbucks, I'm at a Marriott hotel and I get breakfast there, or on an Air Canada flight or an Air Canada lounge. So, what's my favorite of all of those? Probably Starbucks. So, I hate to disappoint you, but uh, I'm not an
So
exciting person, and and early mornings are not my favorite times of the day.
so we're talking about like a breakfast sandwich from Starbucks.
A grande latte and some sort of poisonous food. They used to have
Pastry. I,
great scones, no longer. So whatever is there.
yeah, I know you like sweet things in the
Yeah,
morning. When we
yeah,
have breakfast, you're the one to grab the pastries. I like it.
yeah.
Okay. And then lastly, a book for us. I know you've probably read a few books in your career. Um, Give us one that you think would that you'd like to share.
Well, it's interesting. I joke around that I stopped reading a long time ago because the only reason I read was to sort of help me understand things and make decisions better. And then I realized none of these books were helping. So I give you two sort of recent authors. I don't remember the exact names offhand. One is Irvin Student, former student of mine, the best student I've ever had by far, one of the brightest people I've ever known. And he's written now, I think, three different books on the way forward for Canada. One of them said, Canada needs to move to a population of 100 million to be taken seriously. He persuaded me about the potential of the North as a second book, and he's written a third now on what the true economic and social fallout has been from the absurd COVID policies. So he really probably is the leading thinker in Canada on major policy issues. So anyone,
What's his name? What's his name again? Let's make sure we don't miss that.
Irvin, Irvin, student, Studin.
Very interesting. It's a good thing I was never in your class. Just want to say.
And then Thomas Sowell. When he started writing, yeah, he was too far right. He was a conservative. I was sort of the liberal, the left of center. In grad school, my nickname was Fred the Red. So I don't think I've changed. I think the world has just moved farther to the left. And I developed a greater appreciation of his work in terms of looking at social issues from an economic perspective. And he has brilliant insights, and he truly understands the failure of government policy in the US as it's tried to deal with poverty and closing the income gaps, improving the economic position of African Americans. So, his latest book, I bought it on Amazon, read it in a couple of hours, and said, truly brilliant. Unfortunately, politicians don't listen to his advice.
Well, because they listen to where they're going to get votes. I mean, we could go have a whole other podcast on that. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
But his name again, so we don't miss it.
Thomas Sowell, Sowell.
Thank you so much. As everyone we've had one of our largest crowds here listening live, and you can all see why we get together either for pastries or lunch or breakfast or dinner because it's always wonderful to hear Fred's perspectives on things. Thanks, Fred. Stay well.
Thank you very much. What Anthony didn't tell you is that when we get together, we usually place bets on what's the next Canadian company to fail. And, that's for self-entertainment. But no, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure. It's always wonderful to see you, Anthony.
Did you want to give us one?
No.
We'll keep that off the record. I know.
I've been wrong too many times. So no, I don't want to mislead people.
Very good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Stay strong.
Take care.